Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. It's a pleasure to welcome back to the program Manisha Sinha. She is chair of American history at the University of Connecticut, author of The Rise and Fall of the Second American Republic, Reconstruction, 1860 to 1920. Professor, welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much for having me, Sam.
So let's start with this, which is, I think, like in terms of your work here, the maybe the most sort of obvious question: Reconstruction, 1860 to 1920. A lot of people who talk about Reconstruction, like this starts after the war, 1865, 1866, 67, and then goes. There's some dispute, like is it 12 years, is it 15 years? But you refer to this whole era as Reconstruction. Let's just start broadly, why?
Yes, that's a great question. The traditional understanding of Reconstruction, which is the period immediately following the Civil War, as you said, it starts in 1865 when the war ends, and usually the period goes up to 1877 when the last Reconstruction state governments fall in the South. There's a so-called Compromise of 1877, which some historians dispute now. And that's the traditional chronology. And so Reconstruction doesn't make much of an impact on people looking at American history. It just sort of seems to last a very short while, and then it's gone. And I thought in order to really understand the pivotal role of Reconstruction in U.S. history in shaping our present-day political traditions and understanding some of the issues that we still live with, that we had to look at the start of the war. Or even with the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, when the first Southern states leave the Union. And really, I extended the timeline right up to the end of the 19th century, because Reconstruction doesn't really get over until you have in place the disfranchisement of Black men in the South and the Jim Crow system, which is green-lighted by the Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. So my book pays a lot of attention to what I call the unwinding of Reconstruction between 1877 and 1900, and then looks forward a bit to the 19th Amendment in 1920 that gave women the right to vote. I call that the last Reconstruction Amendment.
It does, following your work here, it really does sort of feel like we need another word, we need another era. I know, part of it is referred to as the Gilded Age, but there is, the counter-reconstruction, the deconstruction or whatever, because it really does, so much of that is important in acknowledging and telling the story of Reconstruction, because maybe, just so that everybody's on the same page here, you can tell people just the history of our understanding of Reconstruction, the Dunning School, the sort of revisionist era, and because we don't have a name for the sort of unwinding of Reconstruction, because to a large extent, the story of Reconstruction was obscured in many ways, in part by that unwinding.
Absolutely. That's just a great point that you're making there. If we look at the ways in which at least academic historians wrote about Reconstruction, you mentioned the Dunning School at Columbia University, my alma mater, and many of his students, they were really interested in trying to show that Reconstruction was a big failure, and that giving citizenship rights to Black people immediately on emancipation was a huge mistake. And that view of Reconstruction as this awful period of Black misrule and political corruption really went hand in hand with lost cause mythologies of the Civil War. It's only outside academia that you had somebody like W.E.B. Du Bois, a Black activist and scholar, intellectual, who wrote the first comprehensive history of Reconstruction that challenged this view in the 1930s. And his sort of timeline was also expanded a bit, like mine. He also looked at the 1880s because he was interested in looking at exactly how Reconstruction was overthrown through a combination of domestic racial terrorism in the South, but also the ways in which the Supreme Court gutted federal civil rights laws and the Reconstruction era constitutional amendments. And then we had historians who sort of went back to the traditional timeline. My own mentor, Eric Foner, who wrote the book on Reconstruction in the 1980s, went back a bit further. He went back to the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, but he also ended in 1877. And I guess my book is a bit of a sequel to his book because I really did want to look at this period after 1877 because a lot happens then. There are still experiments in interracial state governments in the South, in North Carolina, in Tennessee, and Virginia in the 1890s. There is still a lot happening in this period. And as you mentioned, we look at this period normally as the Gilded Age. But the takeoff of industrial capitalism in the North is really connected to the fall of Reconstruction and to the North's sort of giving up on this project of interracial democracy in the South.
And I should say, I think for a lot of people, there's an awareness of this, but I think it's always important to remind everybody, when you say domestic racial terrorism, it's not a metaphorical, that's not, we're talking literally pogroms, violence attacking black politicians, black middle class, whether we're talking like Wilmington or Atlanta, Oklahoma, I think people are aware of, but there are multiple examples of this, ranging from like how many people were killed, how many people were threatened, firebombed, whatnot, driven out of office, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so let's get into sort of those things that lay the groundwork for Reconstruction, and then into the era that where you suggest it is not like that there is a tension within the Republican Party, in which, remind people, it was the radical Republicans, but they lost their power in this. So there wasn't a sense that the Republicans saw that, Reconstruction as they had planned it as a function of these emancipatory amendments to the Constitution were failures, and they had decided to turn course. It was that the sort of counter-revolutionary forces, if you want to say, simply gained more strength, and in part because of what you were saying was happening with the Northern industrialists.
Absolutely. That's just such an excellent point. The notion that somehow the radicals or the abolitionists, who the radical Republicans were closely associated with, simply gave up on this emancipatory project is simply untrue. The fact is that their opponents outlasted them. In the South, as you mentioned, there is a full-scale campaign, and I should say domestic racist terrorism with, sort of paramilitary forces like the Ku Klux Klan, the First Klan, the White Liners, White Brotherhood, the Red Shirts in South Carolina. And this was targeted political violence against freed people, but also against white Republicans and office holders in the South. So there's this huge campaign of terror that they've undertaken. And within the Republican Party in the North, there's an increasing feeling, especially in the second term of Ulysses Grant's administration, that the North should, and the Republican Party should simply withdraw from the South now, that this was getting too much. There was just sort of fatigue about this. People were far more interested in economic problems in the North with the Great Recession of 1873 and then the railroad strikes in 1877. But what you hinted at in your question, which is, I think, so important, is that the Republican Party is transformed from the party of Lincoln and anti-slavery and black rights during the Reconstruction era to increasingly a party that is far more concerned with putting down strikes in the North, and starts listening to Southern political elites who are complaining about the interference, so-called interference, of the federal government in Southern local affairs. And this group of Republicans, they were called the liberal Republicans, liberal not as you and I understand it today, modern liberalism, but as classical laissez-faire liberals who believe that government should simply not interfere in society or in economics at all. So no regulation of working hours or minimum wage in the North, but also that meant doing away from a commitment to Reconstruction in the South. And these liberal Republicans, they challenged Grant in the 1872 elections, and they join up with Democrats, which at that time, of course, was the party of the South and white supremacy, and they lose. But by 1877, they actually capture the Republican Party. And their capture of the Republican Party is exactly what results in this party of Lincoln and anti-slavery becoming increasingly the party of big business during the Gilded Age, and also eventually the party of imperialism.
And you know, there's a it's appropriate for me to bring this up here because there's like a mirror image in my mind that comes up as you make the argument that this expansionism and imperialism and industrialism both almost like transfers the energy that was going into Reconstruction into a project to essentially commit genocide and expand westward, and then also become that energy is also used to expand in terms of like our hemisphere. Seems to me to be almost like a mirror image of what the Trail of Tears and the expulsion of indigenous people around Georgia and whatnot, how that the energy to expel indigenous folks in Georgia and push them on to the Trail of Tears was really just a way to make the land available to bring in slavery and work it for cotton. And sort of like then almost that energy like happens in another way on the other end of this sort of emancipatory project, both the Civil War and Reconstruction. Talk about that, but I just also want to mention before we get out of that era of Reconstruction, 600, I didn't realize 600 schools were established by freed people. And it gives you a notion of why there is, because ultimately we're going to tie this back to this era, but attacking public schools is so rooted in what their first sort of like mission was as a broad project, which is create citizens from people who have been exploited and empower them. And we see that attacks on public education today, I think for the same reasons we did 150 years ago. But talk about that second wave, like that battle within the Republican Party is won by the sort of more imperialistic and industrial. Where do they start to channel this energy? Because this is like almost like a bipartisanship at this point.
Absolutely. And again, two great points that you made there. One, of course, the American Republic was founded on native dispossession. And the worst instances were, as you mentioned, in the antebellum era of the Trail of Tears, in the 1850s, genocidal warfare against indigenous nations in Oregon, in California. And many Southern slaveholders had this vision of a pro-slavery empire in the West that would be based on Indian dispossession and Black enslavement. They were quite clear about that. There was a southern form of imperialism. They even invaded illegally some of our neighboring states and countries. So it's quite clear that that this process was ongoing. That's why the Civil War and Reconstruction, I argue, present a real course correction in American history, because suddenly the federal government is moving federal troops out of the West and to the South to fight this Civil War and eventually to liberate Black people once emancipation becomes the formal stated goal of the Union Army. And all through Reconstruction, federal troops are deployed in the South, even though towards the end of the period, they're increasingly being taken out. But once the commitment to Reconstruction is completely over, what do? They restation exactly the same troops into the West to conduct these wars of imperialism, really. And I recognize them as such. There are a lot of American historians who see the Indian Wars, better called wars against Indians, as simply a continuation of the Civil War. And I argued, no, this is a completely different political project. And it cannot be equated to the Civil War. And in fact, it is the defeat of the emancipatory project of the Civil War and Reconstruction that eventually leads to the conquest of the West and the elimination of the last indigenous sovereignties there. And from then, it's a springboard to the Spanish-American-Cuban War, the colonization of Philippines, informal empire in Cuba, the acquisition of Hawaii and Puerto Rico. You really get the rise of a formal American empire. The United States joins the scramble for empire. But the other point that you made, which I think is so important, is the idea that during Reconstruction, there's a real commitment in the South to establish the public school system. A lot of Americans don't know this, but the public school system that emerged in New England and was common in the North before the Civil War as an important facet of democratic citizenship, right? You make available education to all American citizens was not there in the South, where elites could access private education.
And to be clear, for white or Black?
Well, for Black people, extremely difficult, even in the North, to get access to education.
I'm saying in the South.
In the South, yeah. In the South, yeah. Southern whites, if you were poor, you did not have access. Absolutely. Yeah, sorry, I misunderstood. So in terms of the kind of educational system available in the South, you didn't have a widespread public school system as you did in the North. And the Reconstruction state governments, one of the first things they do is they tax elites in order to build up a public school system, asylums, orphanages, all the kinds of services that were available in the North, but not so widespread in the South. And then that's when elites start attacking the public school system, Southern white elites, and they start forming taxpayers' conventions saying, we don't want to be taxed for public schools. So this attack on public education is something that is old. And it emerges during Reconstruction. You can still see it as very much a formative sort of agenda of political conservatism today, that education should be widely and freely available to American citizens. And this is also the time when you have the formation of the historically Black universities and colleges. And that is extremely important in terms of the development of Black education. You have somebody like Kamala Harris, who got her degree from Harvard University, which began as, an HBCU during the Reconstruction era. And there were hundreds of them in the South, freedmen schools. The first one established where the Union first established a stronghold during the Civil War at Hampton, which eventually became Hampton University. So this was one of the huge achievements of Reconstruction that we normally don't talk about, and that is the emergence of the public school system in the South and the emergence of historically Black colleges and universities.
Well, I guess this is a two-part question. Was the assault, the sort of like the counter-revolutionary impetus to attack the public schools, because they were able to close a lot of those schools, was that how much of that was pure racially motivated versus class motivated? Because we see this also in the restrictions on voting in the South, that we're just as happy to dispossess poor white votes as we are any black votes, essentially, because neither one of them is our constituency. So that's the first part of the question. And does HBCUs, do they survive because on some level there's a sense of like, well, who's going to get there if we undermine, K through 12? We don't have to worry about the sort of like political threat associated with the small, and I guess presumably from their perspective, sort of an upper class of black people, a more sort of like economically elite black population, because they'll be small enough that, and maybe our interests will be slightly more aligned, that they won't be as much of a political threat.
Yes. So again, two excellent questions right there. There's this debate in Southern history, the race versus class debate. And I wrote about this in my first book, which was a book on Southern political history. This notion that somehow that there was sort of white liberty based on black slavery, so all whites were sort of equal and free together. And this is such a wrong way of looking at Southern history, because we know slaveholding planters in particularly aggrandized economic and political power in the antebellum South at the cost, particularly, of course, of the enslaved, but also of poor whites and white farmers in the South. So this notion that somehow a race trumped class and that class did not matter in the South is incorrect. I mean, these people were conservative at all levels. They were racist. They tended to be misogynists too. They were very much against the abolitionist movement because they saw it as a threat in terms of arguing for women's rights. And they were also elitists. They were classists. They had malapportioned state legislatures that overrepresented slaveholding counties. Pretty much what the 3/5 clause did for them at the federal level. They were overrepresented and they aggrandized political power. And this was a constant debate in the South. So after Reconstruction, when you have all these disfranchisement plans that are put into place, whether they're poll taxes, literacy clauses, yes, they end up disfranchising a lot of Southern whites. And once Black people are locked into this sharecropping system and Reconstruction is overthrown and they enter these sort of debt peonage relationships with planters and merchants, that happens to Southern poor whites too, many of whom also fall under the trap of disfranchisement. And some of them more particularly, lose their farms, become tenants and sharecroppers. So the fall of Reconstruction has an adverse impact on democracy as a whole and on Southern society as a whole. And there is this sort of provincial elite in the South that does this. And they are quite tolerant of the HBCUs, maybe because they're not racially integrated. One of the main things that they were worried about with the public school system was to, in fact, segregate these schools according to race. And once you have the rise of the populist movement in the 1890s, that poses a bit of a challenge to these democratic elites in the South. And at that time, of course, remember the Democratic Party was the party of white supremacy and states' rights and racial illiberalism. They go about disfranchising poor whites thoroughly also. For African Americans, there were various strategies on how to survive the fall of Reconstruction. And Booker T. Washington, who emerges as the sort of foremost accommodationist to this new segregationist regime, makes an argument that maybe Black education should not be so much in liberal arts or fighting for political and civil rights, that it should be really a vocational education so that Black people can fit a certain position in the Southern economy. And his Tuskegee Institute in Alabama does that. So there is a real attempt to limit Black education. The HBCUs, though, survive mainly because of Northern white philanthropy, and Booker T. Washington is, he has a machine where he also gets a lot of money, and even though he puts up an accommodationist face, on the sidelines, he is financing campaigns against lynching and racial violence in the South also. So he's a complicated figure, but somehow Black education outlasts this attempt to destroy it. We know that during Reconstruction, Black schools and churches are targeted and they're burned to the ground. I mean, that burning Black schools and churches continues right down to the Civil Rights era and beyond. So this attack on it continues, but it does outlast it. And one of the achievements of freedom is to see the literacy rate amongst the Black population grow up dramatically in the post-Civil War period, even in the post-war South. And even land ownership, which had been sort of done away with by Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln to the presidency, he gave back all the land that had been redistributed to freed people back to the planters. Even land ownership ticks up slowly but steadily until the end of the 19th century. So all this in the most dismal circumstances. So if there had been a level playing field, if in fact Black people had access equally to education and to land ownership, the progress would have been much more.
You mentioned the populace. The rise of the populace created a dilemma for the Southern elite. Because they were having trouble from what I know, particularly I think in the context of North Carolina, but probably more broadly speaking, motivating voters who were enticed by the Populist Party. Motivating them based on racism, because the Populist Party was, I guess, presumably educating them as to hey, there's another sort of lens in which you can sort of see what's going on here. You didn't lose your, you weren't kicked off this farm because of Black people. You were kicked off the farm because of rich people. How did and this is sort of part of I guess the counter-revolutionary movement. And we should say, the idea that we have this Union Army, the pressure to push them out of their job in essentially occupying the South, leaves them just standing around. And it's instead of turning their swords into plowshare, into plows, they're still swords. And so somebody's oh, we can use these. And we have this resource to essentially become imperialistic to our West and to our South. When we talk about Cuba, we talk about the Caribbean, and even Hawaii, I guess, at that point. What do these Southern elites deploy to turn the populace and sort of, I guess, mitigate their political threat? And then it feels like that whatever it is that they unleashed carries through into the 1920s, essentially. So, the graphs go in two different directions. At one point, you do have women's emancipation, at least in the context of the vote, but you also get this rising sort of racism. How do they do that?
Yes, again, great questions right there. The populist movement is really important. They may not have been completely racial egalitarians in the South, but you're right. They had developed an economic critique of large planters and merchants in the South, including the railroads, and how they were squeezing out ordinary farmers. So it really takes off in the West and in the South. And they had really progressive ideas. I mean, they wanted to abolish the Electoral College. They wanted to give women the right to vote. They wanted the federal government to intervene in the economy, develop a kind of a collective system to make easy credit available to farmers. So their vision, their economic vision, would have really upended the plantation system, which was wringing poor white people and Black people dry. And they do win a measure of political power. And African Americans are organized in the Colored Farmers Alliance, their own alliance. They're organized in the Agricultural Wheel, which was particularly popular in Arkansas, which was basically agricultural workers who were predominantly Black. But they do manage to form a political alliance in North Carolina, as you mentioned. They form a fusion government that comes into power at the state and city level. Elsewhere in the South, even in the Deep South, the Knights of Labor and the Populists get together and present a bit of a challenge to this conservative, one-party, solid South democratic rule of planters and other political elites. So they are viewed as a complete threat. Eventually, of course, they are sort of incorporated within the Democratic Party by 1896, and that's pretty much the end of populism. But in North Carolina, the way that government is overthrown is, in fact, exactly using the tactics that Southern elites had earlier done to overthrow Reconstruction governments, which was, massive racial terror. The red shirts of South Carolina that had actually overthrown and at the head was Wade Hampton of many of these movements in South Carolina that overthrew the Reconstruction government in 1876, they come to North Carolina in the 1890s and they give them kind of lessons in political terrorism on how to get rid of these governments. And you mentioned the Wilmington Massacre of 1898 that took place in North Carolina. This was a city government, an interracial city government. And there was a group of men, a mob, led by a Confederate officer. In fact, a street was named after him. It was taken down only after the George Floyd protests, who literally massacred hundreds of African Americans and destroyed the city government in a coup. Literally a coup, a political coup. And what's interesting about this Wilmington mob is that many of the men who constituted it were part of the Wilmington Light Infantry that had fought in the Spanish-American-Cuban War that same year. So you can see the connections between imperialism and the notion that somehow non-white people are unfit for self-government or for the rights of citizenship, a lesson they had learned, apparently, from overthrowing Reconstruction in the South, and then they disseminate throughout the Pacific and the Caribbean. And certainly at that point, the acquisition of Puerto Rico, but the brutal colonization of Philippines, which was very much like the Indian Wars, because no rules of warfare were implemented. You had awful torture. Waterboarding, for instance, was invented during the so-called pacification of the Philippines. And the very same generals that had conducted sort of uncivilized warfare against the native nations were doing this in the Philippines, massacres of civilians, and etc. So I think it's important to understand how all these things are linked. And I tried to do that in my book. It was a complicated story to tell, but I think one that was important to tell because too often American historians had seen all these developments as simply the growth of the nation state and the growth of the federal government during Reconstruction. Many historians before me who had tried to expand the boundaries of Reconstruction, like Richard White, et cetera, had made that argument. And I'm saying, no, this was a completely different project. And the reason why you have all this happening is precisely because Reconstruction failed or was overthrown, rather, and not because you have the growth of a powerful nation state that can suddenly do all these things. It had to be diverted from a particular progressive political project to a particularly reactionary one. And that's the only way one can understand the contestation during this period.
And that's where I guess I want to move back to the North to talk about the liberal Republicans and the takeover, I guess, of that ideology with the Republican Party, how quickly that happened. Two, was there this kind of sense of like, okay, we diverted our expansionist resources to fight the Civil War. We were unable to fight, both the indigenous people to take their land and then also fight the Civil War. We couldn't do that on both fronts, right? And so it's time to get ours, right? It's time to get our money. It's time to expand. It's time to cash in. Was that part of it as well? Like this kind of sense that we've won the Civil War and now it's time to triple down on expanding and then even going, beyond the bounds of North America as well?
Well, one could say that the Civil War was successful. It was won by the North. The peace, especially after the overthrow of Reconstruction, is won by the South. So the liberal Republicans do take over the party already with the 1876 presidential elections. I call it, as Sam referred to earlier, the counterrevolution of 1876, because not only do the Southern interracial state governments fall, but Rutherford B. Hayes, who becomes president, appoints all these liberal Republicans to his cabinet, and he tells the federal troops in the South to stand down. He doesn't completely remove them, but he moves them back into their barracks, which basically means they're ineffectual in enforcing Black rights. And the only way the U.S. Army, that had expanded a lot during the Civil War, sort of retains somewhat of a larger presence is because it is then deployed in Indian warfare. But this is a very different project. It doesn't sort of stem seamlessly from deploying them in the South. In fact, by the end of Reconstruction, many Black Union soldiers have certainly been disbanded, and the level of the troop presence in the South has gone down dramatically. So all these things do happen, but it is not as if it's the same state doing the same with the same goals or the same people. The liberal Republicans have come into power. Conservative Democrats are constantly challenging federal laws in the South. There are some last attempts in the North to try and enforce election laws in the South, but they are defeated through a combination of conservative Republicans joining up with Democrats. So for free people, and for any progressive at that time, it's a pretty dismal situation. On the one hand, you have a Republican Party that has completely, left its progressive origins. And on the other hand, you have this kind of states' rights, anti-government, anti-public school systems, anti-any progressive legislation for labor, women, or Black people, highly racist party in the Democratic Party. And it's not until the progressive era that the Democratic Party starts changing and the Republican Party completely gives up on Black rights. And we get our modern political party system of today, which is cemented during the Civil Rights Movement, eventually with the Dixiecrats leaving the Democratic Party. So I don't think that it is simply a natural result of the growth of the state, because conservatives, especially within the Democratic Party, remain huge critics of what they call big government, even then. And so we can trace the roots of many of our political traditions in terms of modern liberalism and conservatism, precisely to the politics of Reconstruction and its aftermath.
And to be clear, it feels like, the story of this is nature abhors a vacuum, and that as the federal troops go back into their barracks, essentially, it gives the opportunity for the rump, I guess, of whatever the Confederate movement was, both its sort of military wing and its moneyed wing, and the idea that they literally have to wage violent coups, or the existence of some violent coups present the threat in other places. Like they leverage it, it's like you only have to do it a couple of times before everybody gets the message as to what can happen to you and your family. That energy that is associated there both essentially eliminates the memory of what has taken place there, On Monday, we had black politicians here. On Friday, we don't. And by the following Monday, we never did. And that energy is where we end up moving into the first couple of decades of the 20th century, where there's this like triumphant, violent racism. And by 1920 or so, we've got 6 million. We've got literally 6-7% card-carrying members of the KKK in this country.
Absolutely. People forget that the South waged a form of guerrilla warfare immediately after the Civil War that they kind of don't give up on. They never accepted the results of the war. Why does Reconstruction succeed in places like Germany and Japan after the Second World War, but it doesn't in the South? Because for the most part, and most of them in those two countries had actually accepted the results of the defeat. The South never accepts defeat. It gets encouraged by the Johnson presidency. So we can actually see that in the South, many of these ex-Confederate generals, like Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was a slave trader before the war and had, massacred Black Union Army soldiers during the war, joined the Ku Klux Klan. John Gordon, George Gordon, they're Confederate soldiers and generals who have joined the Ku Klux Klan, the White Liners, the Red Shirts, and who are waging this sort of targeted political warfare against not just Black people, but against white Republican office holders. I mean, they kill a congressman in Arkansas. They kill, they're targeted political assassinations. The red shirts are a lot like the brown shirts and black shirts of fascism. They're going around killing voters, but also sheriffs and officers and state senators and house. So they are trying to send a message. And the killing is gruesome and violent. I describe some of them in some detail in my book because I think we need to know how barbaric this kind of violence was. They want to send a message. They want to terrorize people into submission. And to a large part, they managed to overthrow Reconstruction simply because once those enforcement acts that were passed by Grant and Congress in his first administration, you could call them the first federal hate crime laws. In fact, people evoked them after the January 6th insurrection. People said, well, we have these enforcement acts in the books that we can still use from the Reconstruction era. Those are not being enforced in the South anymore. The political will isn't there. The federal government is undertaking other projects. And it comes at a period of what I call a thermidor, a general reaction, a conservative backlash to the achievements of Reconstruction in every respect. Women's suffrage falters. You have these wars of empire. These troops are deployed not just against Native nations, but against labor to break up unions and strikes and to fire at them. Many governors in the North use Reconstruction era laws to ask for federal government intervention for law and order and literally put down and mow down striking workers. So this general reaction affects everyone, but it begins in the South. And this notion that somehow this is just a loss for Black freedom. No, the nadir in Black freedom is also the nadir in American democracy as a whole for this period.
We could go on for a long, long time, but I want to just draw some parallels to this current era. I mean, I actually believe you could take the Supreme Court and, take the technology out of where they're working, and you could trace the Supreme Court in the late 19th century and the early 20th. I mean, through the first couple of decades of the 20th century, do an outline and almost like just lay it perfectly on top of where the Supreme Court is today. And we're just on the verge. I mean, a new Lochner era as well. But in terms of their first assault was on voting rights and trying to roll back, the expansion of voting rights that take place in the wake of the Civil War was then met with the Supreme Court maybe we can lose some here, we can lose some. what else do you see in the context of like sort of the broader sort of political currents that is similar to that era, and where does it tell us as to where we might be going?
That's a brilliant question because, you could do an exact map on the awful role that the Supreme Court plays in sort of kneecapping American democracy during the post-Reconstruction era and today. There's kind of an exact match there, unfortunately. It seems the Supreme Court, the Warren Court that was liberal, that tried to enforce Reconstruction era amendments and laws and was called activists for doing that, has been a brief blip in the history of the Supreme Court. On the whole, it has acted against American democracy and overreached, massive judicial overreach. You see this during Reconstruction, starting with the Cruikshank decision in 1876, where they refused to indict or let the perpetrators of a massacre, the Colfax massacre in Louisiana, go scot-free. And in fact, one of the members of the White League of Louisiana becomes a justice of the Supreme Court in 1894, plays a part in a vociferous defense of the 1896 Plessy decision that instituted Jim Crow, and also the disfranchisement of Black men in Williams versus Mississippi in 1898. And then this guy goes on during the Lochner era to become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So you can imagine how awful this court was. They also misinterpreted the 14th Amendment that protected the rights of freed people to say that it was protecting the rights of corporations against regulation. This is where we get corporations are people. And even though corporations did have a legal personhood before this, by this time they become out of reach of state and federal government regulation. It's not until the Progressive Era, New Deal, that we're able to overturn that a little bit. The Supreme Court today has acted in a similar manner. You can begin with Bush v. Gore, but you can also see recently in Shelby County versus Holder, 2013, the gutting of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which in its title says that it is simply enforcing the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which is a Reconstruction era amendment. So the Supreme Court today, despite, in refusing to even implement the 14th Amendment, which has a clear bar on anyone who has committed insurrection against the government of the United States after taking an oath of office to uphold the U.S. Constitution, they've gotten rid of that too. And you can only run for office after committing insurrection if you are pardoned by 2/3 of Congress, which many ex-Confederates were. But now we don't even, that is not implemented anymore. There's so many parts of the 14th Amendment that, if implemented today, our democracy would be more secure. For instance, if any state indulged in voter suppression, then they would lose representation in Congress. It was never implemented during the Jim Crow era, but we could implement it today against bad faith attempts to suppress voter turnout and kick people off registration rolls. We are seeing that happen as I speak today. So the Supreme Court, yes, has played a pretty bad role during the Gilded Age era. They got rid of the 1875 Civil Rights Law, which would have outlawed segregation before it was implemented. So there's a whole host of decisions that they make that make it easier for us to have Jim Crow and rapacious capitalism, right, without any checks from the government. So I think the Supreme Court as a whole has played an extremely anti-democratic and conservative role in our history. Maybe with the exception of the Warren Court and some others, it's not been a great history.
I mean, it's sort of fascinating because that era of the Warren Court is also, I mean, you look at like as far afield as like Thomas Piketty and his argument that like that era, more or less, in terms of wealth inequality, was also a blip in an otherwise sort of like specific trajectory, or not even a trajectory. It's sort of like a stasis. But just so lastly, culturally though, like in terms of like what we're seeing, the political forces, because in many respects, right, we are it took a while. LBJ said we've lost the South for a decade, and it really turned out that he, was almost too generous in his assumption as to how quickly the people of the South would realize what the Democratic Party had done. I mean, there's I cite this all the time. It was in a book, and it wasn't Sides, although he wrote a book with this professor who had found the statistic that in 2008, half of non-college educated whites believed the Republican Party was to the left of Democrats on race as late as 2008. And it was like Barack Obama shows up and they're like, oh, wait a second, what's going on here? And it feels like the elites are doing the same thing they did in many respects as a way of sort of like mitigating the populists at that time, which is let's activate race as a mechanism of completely obscuring class in this context. Although, Vance comes in and talks a little bit of that game, but you can afford to do that now because you can't really follow, I think, for your average person, like, oh, this guy's for workers' rights and for this, that, but votes against them. Like you can get away with some of that stuff in a way that today, maybe there were eras where you couldn't as well. But where are we in that trajectory? Like, are we in the counter-revolution now? And what does that say about where we might be headed, with all understanding that's outside the portfolio of a historian?
No, this is something that really interests me, and that, students often ask me, this partisan realignment that takes place, starting with the New Deal, I would say, where African Americans slowly, and the great migrations to northern cities, they start moving towards the Democratic Party. And it really comes together with the civil rights movement when the Democratic Party under Johnson formally comes behind the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act. This is something that does sort of initiate the change, the flipping of the two parties ideologically. And this continues, of course, because the Republican Party, beginning with sort of Nixon's Southern strategy, but also Reagan, going to Philadelphia, Mississippi, going to Bitburg in Germany, makes it quite clear that their position on race is not the same as the party of Lincoln was in the 19th century. They always evoke Lincoln, but what they stand for today is pretty much the opposite. And their base today is pretty much in the ex-Confederate states and in some of the more red Western states. So I would say really that we are in a similar position where in the South, it's kind of difficult to say that, we've had this sort of solid South during the Jim Crow era, and now we have it's solidly red Republican. There are inroads being made, but there's so much bad faith, and they've sort of become experts at voter suppression and gerrymandering and suppressing the electoral process as a whole. So there's, parts in the South where there are no, there's just like a one-party system. There is no there's no competition in certain counties and districts in Louisiana or Mississippi or Alabama. These people are running unopposed, and they can say and do the weirdest stuff. You have people like Clay Higgins, who is a representative from Louisiana, who was not deemed unfit to even serve in the sheriff's office in Opelousas
Voted
County.
for David Duke. Speaking of the Ku Klux Klan and the percentage of membership during Reconstruction.
Absolutely. And Opelousas, by the way, was the site of a Reconstruction massacre, too. So these histories are very much interconnected. And I think now the Republicans in the South particularly have developed voter suppression as a fine art. And even in some states like in Arizona, in Oklahoma, they're trying all kinds of dirty tricks that Southerners had perfected during the era of disfranchisement and segregation. And it's a continuation of that. It's a continuation of those. But I would say, yeah, maybe we are at that moment where the Supreme Court's behaving like that. The Republican Party today is certainly behaving the way the Democratic Party did in the late 19th century. But the good news here, because I'm, I guess, a perennial optimist, is that that we are aware of that and that we are fighting against it. The dice is loaded in the South in many respects, but if we can crack some of those ways of doing business as usual, maybe there's some hope. I mean, every year there's some hope that we would dislodge these people, and then we are sort of disheartened. In terms of just the misinformation, and people like Vance can get up and say, I represent the blue collar white working class, when he's anti-union, voting against any worker protections, etc., has been a venture capitalist, is bankrolled by venture capitalists. That kind of disinformation that Republicans have perfected today through their own right-wing, news channels, TV, through social media, influencers and YouTube and TikTok, whatever. That's a real danger, and that's a modern thing. In the South, the segregationists had all the white newspapers in their side, and today we have that in terms of the internet. I do think, though, that this is a battle that we have to fight. We often think of the Republican Party as somehow today, despite its very pro-billionaire and pro-corporate policies, is somehow representing this non-college educated white working class, especially white working class men who feel that they have been left behind. But actually, I think a lot of these people tend to be fairly well-off suburban whites too. They are, if you see some of these people, they are not particularly suffering that much. A lot of the problem, I think, in US elections is the people who are really suffering have kind of given up hope. They've sort of lost hope, and they don't participate. In the 2020 presidential elections, we had a 60% participation, but normally the participation is 30, 40%. We make it difficult for poor people to vote, for working class people to vote. There's no holiday. It's not on a Sunday. No advanced democracy does this. We shut off polling booths in cities. We make people stand in line for 6 hours to vote or take a day off from work, which poor people can ill afford to do. We just make it difficult for them to vote. So I am very careful when I talk about who these people, they're appealing to this sort of group of people who are going to vote Republican, as Trump said, no matter what they do. You can shoot a man on Fifth Avenue and they will still vote for him. I think those people are at this point unreachable, and to fight for those people is just, but I think we really do have to activate people who have lost hope in politics, and get back to even our 19th century rates of voting, which was much higher. And now we have a much vaster, a more diverse electorate. We have women. We have this guy in North Carolina who thinks women shouldn't vote. I mean, these people are genuine reactionaries, besides being rather weird in every respect. I think that's our hope. I really think there is, like the populists did, try to create a interracial working class alliance. And I think the Harris-Walz campaign is aiming to do that. But again, a hard nut to crack because of these advantages that Republicans have built in for themselves in these incredibly gerrymandered, voter-suppressed states.
Manisha Sinha, Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut, author of The Rise and Fall of the Second American Republic, Reconstruction, 1860 to 1920. Thanks so much for your time today. We'll put a link to that book at majority.fm and in the podcast and YouTube description. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.